to the first Tasers seminar of 2016, and we're delighted to have Allyn Thomas, one of our PhD students, talking to us today. Just to give you a bit of background about Allyn, he first went to Liverpool University for his first degree. He got a first-class degree in genetics. Whilst he was there, he was also a cinema projectionist, a stage manager, and for many years in the summer holidays he was an archaeologist digging on Roman, Norman and medieval sites. He was also joined to the army whilst he was at University of Liverpool. He was an officer in the intelligence corps, but he bought out his commission after a year to return to the university, and he then had to pay back the army his fees for his degree. The total price of £2,473.33 in 1977. I think you've got a bit of an issue about that.
They let me off 33p.
Oh, they let you off the 33p, which was quite nice of them. So it took him 7 years to pay back what might be described as the first student loan. He then completed a doctorate at Nottingham University in microbial-genetics in the early days of genetic engineering. He then joined the police, and he was in Hampshire, and latterly the Assistant Chief of Police of Kent, which is when I sort of first met you. He was saddened throughout his service by the lack of tolerance and understanding of mental illness, partly in the service but mostly by the public. After 30 years being in the police, he retired from Kent as the Assistant Chief Constable, and he returned to part-time study at the Tasers Centre. So tonight he's going to be talking about his current PhD, Mad, Bad or Sad, the use and abuse of police powers to detain the mentally disordered. Thanks very much.
Thank you. If I run out of puff, shout, because I managed to crack a rib yesterday and I'm well strapped up, but it does mean it's hard to breathe on occasion, so I've got my excuse in early. Such is life. So, I hope to talk today to demonstrate the sad and bad part of the police use of powers to detain people. It's a matter for you, I think, to decide whether that's actually a mad use of public authority and public funds. What I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about Section 136, which is the power. Tell you a little bit about the origin of Section 136, the historical origin. A little bit about the publicly available figures about police use of this power, and then tell you about my research. To start with the power itself, this is Section 136. You can see, if a constable, it's a constable in uniform, if a constable finds in a place to which the public have access, so it's a little bit wider than public places, so football stadiums, places where people can go, appears to him, legal jargon, it's always him, it's him or her, but they call it him, to be suffering from a mental disorder, and it's what, in the opinion of a police officer, is a mental disorder. So it's not clinical guidance, it's just what they think is a mental disorder. And then the second criteria, they're in immediate need of care, and then the constable may, if in the interest of that person or the protection of others, remove them. Remove, nice word, kind of arrest, usually it's called detention, but remove is a nice word. And the whole purpose of this is to enable the person to be taken to a place of safety. I'll come back to a place of safety, and they may be detained there for up to 3 days. I'll come back to the origin of 3 days, and the whole purpose is to enable them to be examined with a view to determining whether their mental disorder, their mental impairment or illness actually would benefit from treatment. If the decision is that it won't, then they would be released, and if the decision is that it would, then obviously they'd be subject to the treatment. Historically, if you go back, right back to the 12th century, there has always been legal provision to deal with wealthy people who are mentally ill. And effectively, historically, there were two categories of mental illness. Idiocy, which was congenital, you were born with idiocy, a lot of congenital idiocy, oh my God. Is that the 10 minutes, do you think? No. So you were born with idiocy, and it was a permanent condition, or lunacy. And lunacy was a condition that came on later in life. So for wealthy people, there's always a legal provision for how you deal with idiocy and lunacy. For poor people, it was a matter for their families, or failing their families, the parish, and for the great majority of our history, up until really the early days of the Industrial Revolution, people who were mentally impaired or disordered were lumped in with paupers and the poor. So there was no great distinction between people who couldn't work because they wouldn't work, they were poor, they were paupers, and people who were mentally ill. They were all lumped in together, and there was no distinction in the early poor laws from the 1600s onwards between people who were incapable and people who were capable. And the debate we have nowadays about the idle poor benefit scroungers, oh, it's a debate that goes back at least 500 years. It's a very current one now.
Should we set it for a fortnight or something? Oh, 4 hours, that should be plenty, don't you think?
Yeah.
Oh!
Well done. So, a little bit more then. So, we start finding, really the second half of the 1700s, second half of the 18th century, you start to find legal provision that separates the mentally ill from the rump population that can't work. So I'll just look through this. And this is really one of the first pieces of legislation that separates out these. So, and whereas there are sometimes persons who by lunacy are so disordered of their senses that they're dangerous to be permitted to go abroad, you can see that they can be locked up. You'll also see that there is a provision of 2 justices. It was an engaging hobby in the Middle Ages to put away inconvenient relatives in madhouses, and it was considered that one justice wasn't quite incorruptible enough, so the provision has 2 justices as a safeguard. In fact, putting away wives was a particularly common hobby in this period. So this is the first legislation which is definitely saying people who are mentally impaired are a separate category of people. This is long before the invention of police forces, and you can see the long list of people who could have authority over you. Constables, church wardens, overseers of the poor of the parish, town or place, quite a lot of sort of officials. And leaping forward the best part of 100 years. So under the Asylum Act of 1853, there's a duty to identify paupers who are lunatics wandering at large, and they can be apprehended. And in this provision in 1885, they'll be detained to be presented before a magistrate, and you'll see that they can be detained for up to 72 hours, 3 days, and that's because magistrates might be away for the weekend. So the 72 hours takes you from Friday to Monday, and it's still in the law now. Lots of debate about 72 hours, but that's where it comes from. And then there's a real mass of legislation, second half of the 19th century, with the Asylum Act and all sorts of acts about dealing with madness. And shortly after this, there's another piece of legislation, and this is kind of recognisably heading towards Section 136. Every constable, every overseer who has any knowledge of pauper or not, wandering at large, is deemed to be a lunatic, shall be apprehended. So it's kind of 1890, and we're almost getting there. The other thing that's happened since the last legislation, in 1858, was the Registration of Doctors Act. So after 1858, it was recognised that doctors were a profession. Up until then, I suspect they'd been quacks, really. And so now you find that it's not the magistrates that are responsible for determining lunacy. It's not the magistrates, it's now handed over to doctors. And so you find in this that the alleged lunatic and the foregoing clause is the medical practitioner who's been called in signs a medical certificate. So actually by 1890 you have all the ingredients. You've got a power to detain lunatics in public places, you've got them 72 hours to present them to a magistrate, the magistrate will pass them on to a doctor, a registered practitioner, and the registered practitioner will decide whether or not this person is in need of treatment. So that's the history of Section 136. 2 short leaps. From the 1890 Act, it becomes Section 136 of the 1959 Mental Health Act, and Section 136 is exactly the same in 1959 as it is in 1983. So we get to the present state of the law,
1983.
and for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with it, the Mental Health Act, much amended, but the Mental Health Act provides for the compulsory detention and treatment of people. I can only think of two other acts which are similar. The first is repealed and is the the 1860 Contagious Diseases Act. And this is a charming piece of legislation which enabled the police to detain prostitutes in ports and garrisons, to inspect them against their will to see if they had syphilis, and if they had and were considered contagious, they could be detained until they were no longer considered to be contagious. Fortunately, that piece of legislation has been repealed. The one that remains, interestingly, which I've used once with my police service, is section 37 to 38 of the Public Health Control of Diseases Act of 1984, which allows for the compulsory detention and treatment of someone with TB. If someone has TB and they will not cooperate, because TB is such a contagious disease, then they can be detained. Three bits of legislation. This is the principal one that's left. So part 2 of the Mental Health Act, sections 2 and sections 3. If you're detained under section 136, they will present you for assessment under section 2. And if they consider that you're in need of treatment, psychiatrist, you can be detained for 28 days for assessment. If you've previously been in the system, then they can present you under section 3 for your continuing treatment. And part 3 is concerned with criminals who are mentally ill. And then the context. In 2012-13, 50,000 people were detained under the Mental Health Act. And by 2013-14 it had risen to 53,000 people. When you consider just how coercive this is, you don't have any choice. If the psychiatrist says to you, I think you're ill and you need treatment, your only two options are to say, I'll do it voluntarily, because if you don't do it voluntarily, you'll do it compulsorily. So this is very coercive power.
And in terms of section 136, who says that it's not working?
Well, actually, just about everyone is relevant, really. The vet, college psychiatrist, care quality, HMIC, acid comment. Why do they say it's not working? Come to this: inappropriate places of safety, inappropriate transport, inappropriate use of force, inappropriate length of detention, too many people detained for too little outcome, and a lack of proportionality in terms of race in particular.
So take those a little bit one at a time.
Places of safety. Places of safety should not be police stations. They shouldn't actually be accident and emergency units either. Neither is particularly suitable. Accident and emergency units are really quite unpleasant, frightening places. Police stations are definitely quite unpleasant, frightening places. The HMIC said between 6 to 76% of people detained are taken to police stations. You'll be taken to a police station if you're horribly drunk or intoxicated, because most mental health treatment units won't accept you in that condition, because they say we can't assess you, so there's no point bringing us to. If you're really violent, because most mental health treatment units can't cope with really violent people, and sadly if you're a child. If you take Kent, there is no facility in Kent. The nearest facility to treat an adolescent or a young person who is mentally ill is in South London. So the chances are, if you're a young person or a child and you're detained under this provision, you'll end up in a police station, because what you wouldn't want to do is take a child to an adult mental health unit. It would be wholly inappropriate.
So places of safety are an issue.
And then the Lancet had a view about the whole thing. Now I can populate this a little bit more. Does everyone here know about tasers? So Lancet gun fires two little barbs at you and then they whack 100,000 volts down a wire. The net effect is you lose all voluntary control of your muscles, you fall on the floor, and you're in excruciating pain, because it hurts. It really does hurt. The police have been rolling out, so to speak, the use of tasers. In 2010, tasers were fired on 6,238 occasions. By 2014, tasers were fired by 9,196 occasions. Guess what proportion of discharges of tasers relate to people who are mentally ill? Take a wild guess.
30%.
No, 90% too high, 30% too low. 67% of discharges of tasers are against people that the officer firing the taser considers as mentally disordered. Now you can compound that a little bit, because if you're black, you're 3 times more likely to be shot with a taser than if you're white. So if you're black and you're mentally ill, it must be almost inevitable that you'll get shot with a taser at some point. So when it talks about criminality and stigma and everything else, don't just think about being put in a police van and handcuffed. Don't just think about being put in a cell, the embarrassment of all that. Think about the fact that there's a good chance that you'll get shot with a taser and everything that goes with that. So that's experiences. The numbers are all wrong as well. You won't see the numbers from where you're sitting, but I hope you can see the shape of the graph. So this is 30 years of hospital detentions. It starts down the bottom here at 2,000 a year in 1984, and it reaches 17,000 at the other end 30 years later. Now a little bit of that is because people have been taken to hospital, not taken to police cells in those last few years. But I can correct for that, because if we take 2013-14, there was 17,000, as in the last graph, hospital detentions, and 6,000 police station detentions, so 23,000 detentions. And the proportionality issue really relates to this outcome, because of those 23,000, only on 2,800 occasions did that result in formal treatment under section 2 or 3, 12%. I said it's coercive. The actual number that end up in treatment is probably between 20 and 30%, because, as I said, when the psychiatrist makes you an offer you can't refuse, I'll either section you or come voluntarily, people come in voluntarily. You see later in the figures that the whole process is very coercive. So let's assume it's between 20 and 30%. But arresting, I think it's 25,000 people, detaining 25,000 people a year now, so that 1/5 of them would receive some form of treatment. It's certainly at the bad, sad end of things. And the local context then, 2013-14, Kent and Medway, sort of the old Kent before the unitary authorities, around about 3 detentions a day is the number we're looking at. So what happens to them after they're detained, whether they go to a hospital or not? Another little chart. So the taller brown is the number of detentions, and the 2 smaller ones you can probably just see next to them. That's section 2, part 2, that's section 3, part 3. So the numbers in the treatment band here, at this end, are 30%. So in 2003, around 30% of people were treated. By the time you get to the far end of the chart, 2013, it's fallen to 17%. So you can see there's a trend over time. The numbers are going up, the treatment is going down.
And what can we say about other changes in treatment then?
So, 20 years ago, 95%, 99% of people that were detained were admitted, formally and informally. So 20 years ago it was different. So why was it so different? That's the interesting thing. And the consequence of the convergence in view between the police and psychiatrists was this growth in numbers. So 1995, 465, 2005, 3,385 people informally and formally detained. And then the House of Commons Health Committee got it spot on. With a severe pressure on beds in mental health units, the rate at which detentions under section 136 resulted has fallen to 20%. So it seems to be beds. Beds seems to be the reason why people are not being admitted.
Oh, hang on, did I miss one? Oh no, sorry. Just cover this then as well. So I said lack of proportionality, you're 3 times more likely to be tasered if you're black. Well, actually, the whole of mental health services seem a bit strange. So, top bar, 86% of the population are white, 74% of all mental health treatments relate to white people, and 80% of detention. So, you're underrepresented. White people are underrepresented in mental health services. Mixed race people, pretty proportionate. Asian people, the 3rd row down, Asian people are underrepresented. You would guess, I don't know, you would guess it's a community effect, really, family effect. Black people, 3.3% of the population in this data were black. 11% of all detentions in the under mental health legislation relate to black people. So you're almost 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act if you're black. And you're twice as likely to be detained under Section 136. In fact, there's one publication that points out in London, Section 136 was the principal point of entry for black people into mental health services. Wouldn't go to doctors, a cultural difference. Other is a bit of a paradox, I haven't looked into it, but I guess it's one of those, you tick the other box when it's a bit baffling, but it's only 1% of the population that's listed under. So, we're talking about what the origin of these are. So, is it just... Is it just that the number of detentions are going up, and because the number of detentions is going up, the use of 136 is going up? So another little chart, the blue lines are the number of Mental Health Act detentions. Little brown lines are Section 136, and the black line is the percentage, 136 of the overall total. So you can see at this end, the black line is on 12%, and at the far end, the black line is on 32%. So detentions under Section 136 are rising faster than overall mental health detention. So it's not simply that all the numbers are growing. Something is happening more rapidly with Section 136. And I finally get to beds as a possible explanation. The number of treatment beds, 1987-8, but obviously this is at the tail end of the deinstitutionalisation process. There were 67,000 treatment beds. By 1989 there were 35,000, and by 2009-10 there were 25,000, and the beds have declined every year since then as well. So that is something to do with it, the reduction in the number of beds. And if you look at the occupancy rates of beds, the Freedom of Information request from Community Care magazine, the Royal College of Psychiatrists' best practice guidance for mental health treatment units is a maximum occupancy rate of 85%, because that allows for people to come and go and gives you flexibility. So this is 28 health authorities out of the 44. This is 90% occupancy, 91 to 95%, 96 to 100%, 101 to 105%, 106 to 110%. Just how full can you make a ward? 115%, and finally greater than 116%. What is 116% hospital? Well, they're sleeping on the floor, aren't they? They're sleeping on couches. 85% is best practice. So this kind of paints a picture. There are less beds, the occupancy rates are much higher. So what can we say about the implications of this as far as people who are mentally ill? Physicians must be rationing care on the basis of bed availability. And that must result in delays in admission and higher occupancy levels, which is what we see. Wyeth says this is increased seriousness before admission, and inpatient units which are more disturbed and frightening. And you see this because of assaults on staff as well. So people won't want to be admitted to units which are so unpleasant. And Wall says this will result in early discharge with resultant relapse and readmission. Now if you want to see this in action, a wonderful panorama programme from last November. It's the South London Mental Health Trust, and they're full. They're permanently full. They have two administrative functions. One function spends all day ringing around every other trust in the country to see if they've got a bed. And the other interesting function they have is the daily meeting deciding who is the least worst ill person they can discharge. Not who's the most well person they can discharge, who is the least most ill person they can discharge. See the panorama, it shows it in action. It's absolutely appalling. But, of course, all is not lost because we have community care as well, care in the community. Now the three priority areas of community mental health services: crisis resolution, early intervention, assertive outreach, 29% budget cut since 2010. And given these three priorities areas have been shown to prevent people needing hospital admissions, reductions in such funding may compound the difficulties. So there is no respite in terms of community care either. So I could say to you, well, I've been going for 25 minutes, I can stop now. That's the answer, isn't it? It's all this. There's lots more people out there who are not well, and that must be the explanation for it. But anyway, I pressed on with my research. I started with the police because it was easier to find partners. Health is the devil's own job to get into. And the police don't do ethics. You'll be shocked to hear that, I'm sure. They do human rights compliance and they do data protection compliance, but ethics is a bit of a mystery to them, so it's much easier to get agreement. So I've got quite a lot of one. What is the nature of engagement between the police and those with mental disorders? I've got a bit of two. How do officers decide whether to use this power or not? And I'm just starting to work my way into three. So I'll show you that. So the first volunteer force I found was Gwent. So it's a small Welsh force, it's a bit rural, and it's got Blaenau and various deprived Welsh valleys, so it's a bit of a mixture. And off their command and control system, I managed to get cut and paste the details of 660 incidents in 7 months, which the force identified involved mental health. How they identify is a bit of a problem, and what you actually have is the operator in the control room types down a version of what the officer on the street has said or what the person on the telephone has said. So there's a little bit of a, is this exactly right sort of issue going on, but there is a duty to be accurate in their records, so I'll show you some in a moment. I'll read them out. And I identified these into 7 types of incidents. Absconders from care, formal or informal. Request for assistance, can you send a policeman, there's no ambulance. My favourite, can you send a policeman to hold down our patient while we inject them? Section 135 is the matching power that goes to Section 136. So if someone's at home, you can't use Section 136. I have to say, when I was a young officer, I would invite them out to finish their cigarette, or have a look at the stars, what about that comet? Anything that got them out of the house, because then they're eligible for Section 136. But Section 135 is a warrant, so there has to be partners. And then of the direct engagement between the public and the police, concerns for welfare, Section 136, crime-related and others. I suspect it's quite a big room, you won't be able to read them all. I wanted to put some down. I'll read them out to you then. These are concern for safety. Top one, member of the public reporting a female on the footbridge saying she's going to jump off the bridge. Very classic. Man in shelter accommodation pulled his cord and was threatening to stab himself. Concern for safety. Officer found a female with no mental health issues who told him she'd taken an overdose. And you always end up kind of second guessing yourself. You could fiddle with these forever. A doctor's surgery rang up to say one of their patients attended the surgery that morning and left behind him some documents about psychopaths and suicide. Would the police like to pop round and just check that he's okay? So, is that concern for welfare, or is that assisting another public health?
It wasn't a suicide, it was just documents.
No, just documents. So I look at these sometimes and think maybe I should move that one back this way or that way or whatever. So they are.
His PhD in ethics and
Yes, that's later, I think, isn't it? Crime-related. What you see is there's a real possibility of overlap between these incidents, but you do the best that you can with them. So a call from a male making criminal allegations, officers attended, and he was threatening to kill himself. So it ended up being something else. A known patient turned up with a knife. YYF is one of the mental health units. So you can see a full firearms authority and all sorts of police officers attended. Another mental health unit patient discharged 20 minutes ago is now saying what's going to firebomb his uncle's house. And Charter Housing raising concerns for a client walking around in an erratic manner with a machete strapped to his back. So you can see it's kind of crime, but you can also see you could, with a little, if it was written down slightly differently, you might classify it as something else. So these are sorts of illustrations of crime. These are quite interesting. So, the caller reported her father was dementia, shouting, slamming doors. The caller stated her father's not been sleeping well, lost his teeth in the night, making him upset. Caller taken to care line, elderly female reporting her husband getting violent. Male with dementia pushed his wife. Male reporting rape, spiritually, not physically. So, officer allocated. Member of the public reported locating confused elderly female in the street. So, police attended, female's carer in attendance. A lot of delusional stuff in the other group, but clearly a lot of stuff around dementia which is not really the same kind of mental illness, but I guess there will be a big growth area in years to come. And these are section 136's. Husband reporting concerns for wife, missing, diagnosed mental health problems. Officer located a female with mental health problems in the street. Member of the public reporting concerns for a female who's left a suicide note under her door. She was located in another town, having got there by bus. This is the 5th time in recent months she's been detained on section 136. There is a small subset within section 136's detentions which are multiple presenters. So I can't get it out of my data at the moment, but I hope at some point to see what proportion of the volume relates to a small group of people. Mother reporting her son wants to die, diagnosed with mental health problems but refuses to go to hospital. The family had pinned him down. I presume when the officers arrived they let him go, and before the officers got hold of him he ran off. So officers and all sorts of people chasing after him to try and find him. So you can see the text is just cut and paste out of command and control. It's got all sorts of abbreviations and spellings. Don't correct any of it. I think the categorisations are reasonably robust, but some of them you could debate. And if we look at the 660 incidents, 358 of them concern requests from other partners for help. That was a surprise to me. I didn't think that so much police time would be taken up with standing in for the ambulance service and other things. But forget those, I'm not looking at those. So that leaves us with 302 incidents which were directly between the police and the public. Concerns for safety, 52%, crime-related 10%, other 17%. Now I've got section 136 listed, but actually section 136 isn't a behaviour, it's an outcome. So what you can do, which I think is quite clever, is you can take the 52, the 9.9 and the 17.2, then take that 20% and reclassify it against these types. And you start to find things that are interesting coming out of the data. So what you find is, whereas overall concerns for safety were just about half of all cases, in the 61 people that were detained under section 136, 81% of them were presenting as self-harm, suicide. So the police over-detain on the basis of self-harm and suicide. They're arresting proportionately more people in that category, much the same in crime-related, and hardly surprisingly in other, it's less, because when you looked at the others you could see dementia and all sorts of other things in there. So in the section 136 detentions, the police are overly detaining people who are presenting as suicidal. Now if you look at the 61 section 136 detentions, you can see no further action at all, 44% of cases, released with a recommended follow-up in the community. Think back to the data on community services. So effectively 70% of people are NFA, no further action. The crisis has passed, they've been let go. And then 30% get some form of treatment. And the informal and section, you can see how you can swap from one to the other depending on how you cooperate. So around about 30% of the 61 people ended up in treatment. Now, if I now look at the 61 and see what the health outcomes were, when it was presented for assessment, what was the outcome at the end of it? So, concern for safety, when we get down to these 61, they're all self-harm. This is not concern for safety anymore, it's much more narrowly defined group. When it comes down to crime, there's no vagueness, it's all violence. And when it comes down to other, it's all delusional behaviour. It's all seeing things that are not there. So, this is the one that's most interesting, formal informal admission. You remember in the previous slide, 30% of people were detained overall. 22% of people where their concerns for safety are actually detained, but 50% of people where there's violence are detained. So what's happening is the police are overly detaining people who are threatening to harm themselves, and the health services are overly detaining people who are presenting as violent. So there's some disparity between the assessments of the two organisations. And it's a very interesting area when we get on to the rest of the data. So, underrepresented in the final outcomes, overrepresented in the final outcomes. Now, there was one other set of data I could get access to. The 61 were the police records of people they detained. I also got access through the police to 105 presentations to health and looked at the health records of detentions. And you can see they looked at it in a slightly different way. They had conduct and behaviour. Fine distinction, perhaps. Conduct and behaviour. And in the conduct, harming others, harming self, threats to harm self, and difficult to manage. The middle two, harming self and threats to harm self. If you look across, 80%. And actually, in the 61 police detentions, it was 80%. So exactly the same sort of proportion of people presenting with self-harm in the hospital-based data compared to the police-based data. And if you look at violent, aggressive, abusive, irrational and other, violent, aggressive and abusive adds up to 16%, which again is very similar to the police data. So what I can then do is I can look at the outcomes. So, in the far column, we've got the number of instances of outcomes. This is sectioned under the Mental Health Act, informal admissions as usual, follow-up recommended, release, no further action. And so these are the numbers from the 105, expressed as percentages, and then in brackets behind is the percentages of the 61, which are the police ones. So you can see the figures are very similar. Section 1310, informal admission 2420, follow-up recommended 2826, release no further action. The police said it was 44%, the health says it's 35%, so there is a disparity in the figures. And the significance of this really is because when you compare the numbers between the police records and the health records, January to July, 61 records of police section 136s, which is 8 per month. April to August, health has 105 records, which is 26 per month. So the shocking thing is, a bit of a paradox really, that health, who probably has the more accurate data, records 3 times as many section 136 detentions as the police. But what I take consolation from is, notwithstanding the difference in volume, the proportions within the figures appear to be very similar. So I don't think there's a systematic error which is reducing a category. It seems to be a random process overall. And then the final thing, you'd be really pleased to hear, the final thing, this study has been done before. So 1990, Bean and his chums interviewed 100 Metropolitan Police officers in Haringey, and they looked at the behaviours of people who were detained under section 136, and then they looked at what was present, what behaviours were present in each incident. And because you can have more than one behaviour, the total adds up to more than 100%. But actually, if you take the bottom ones, self-harm, threats of self-harm, attempted suicide, or threat of suicide, it's hard to see how you double count that really, because if you're attempted suicide, you wouldn't say that was a threat of suicide as well. You tend to say, well, it's just one, isn't it? So the maximum is, if you add the 1, 1, 4 and 3 up, you get 9. But if you look at the absent, you find it's generally around 90. So that would imply that of the section 136 detentions that they were talking about in 1990, about 9% related to self-harm. Well, hold on a second. Now it's 80%. In our current figures, 80% or more of all the presentations of section 136 relate to self-harm. Whereas here, the great majority of behaviours, odd appearance of behaviour, physical injury, violent behaviour, threats of violent behaviour, violence towards property, threats of violence. So what's happening in these figures, which I think is quite a useful prospect then, the conclusions. Reductions year on year in spending on mental health services, undeniable. Very significant growth in police use of section 136, undeniable. The growth in section 136 is accompanied by a reduction in treatment rate following detention, undeniable. There has been a significant change in behaviours leading to detention. And this is only on the basis of comparison of two areas. So previously, significant changes here. Principally, increases in self-harm. So what's happening now is people are ringing up the police and saying they're going to hurt themselves, and they get detained in 80% of occasions for saying that, but health have a low conversion rate of those into treatment. Whereas 20 years ago, the great majority of people that were detained were violent, abusive or aggressive behaviour, and there was a high conversion rate to treatment. So, notwithstanding everything else about the beds and everything else, there seems to be another process going on here, which is about something to do perhaps with the perception of risk. That police officers perceive self-harm as being something that they need to be concerned about, whereas mental health services perceive that violent, aggressive and abusive behaviour is a better indicator of risk. And they both continue to proceed detaining people and treating people on the basis of a completely different assessment. So having got the data from Gwent, I need to go to Gwent to interview the officers to see if I can get to the bottom of this. I've even sent you today part of the application process for the Metropolitan Police to go back to Haringey and do the same data collection again. I had hoped to do it in Essex, but I went to Essex and no one here from Essex, is there? Their computer system is terrible, so it's worse than Gwent's data. So probably not Essex, maybe Cheshire or maybe Hampshire. And then the other bit that I need to do is I need to find a matching health partner for one of the police partners, because I need to look at the other side of the boundary of treatment to understand what's going on in health, which is why the health assessment is taking such a different view from the police assessment. And if you could do that, there might be some relatively simple things to do which could cut down on the number of people being detained. And that's it.
Thanks, Alan. That was really comprehensive and very good. So we have some time for questions. Just before we do questions, I know you said that the police aren't really that bothered about ethics, but I would just point out that as your supervisors, that your PhD study did go through University of Kent ethics. So just to make sure that the people know about that. So are there any questions?
It was a joke. Yes.
I'm just wondering, with the change in the proportions of self-harm in section 136, whether one of the things that's happening is that family members and members of the public, when they find someone who's threatening self-harm, think to themselves, the bloody mental health services are not going to do anything about it, we're going to have to ring the police, because they're the only people that do something. In other words, that it's a function of the reduction in mental health services.
You could certainly imply that from the Gwent data, that 52% of mental health demand was from other partners, particularly from the ambulance service, who so often could not provide ambulance transport to take mentally ill people to hospital, and so police officers were getting called. So I think there is a danger. I did some focus group work, which I've got to read as part of the interview process, and what some officers said was, someone is in crisis at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. They can't get hold of the out-of-hours team because they won't have access to them. So what they do is they ring the police. And they say the immortal words, "I'm going to kill myself," because they know that if they say those words, the police will attend. And then when they get into the Section 136 process, they know exactly what to say to the psychiatrist so they don't get sectioned. So what some of the officers, their perception was that the whole system was being managed by people who were mentally ill, who knew what to say at each different part of the process to get the attention they wanted or the outcome that they wanted. I think that could easily be part of it, and certainly police officers are terrified of something called death in police contact. So if a person who has had some contact with the police within 72 hours of that contact dies, then you're really looking at criminal charges against the police officer and the organisation for corporate manslaughter. So people are so terrified of that as an outcome. And there are lots of notorious. There are lots of notorious cases of people who die in police contact or in police custody who are mentally ill, often undiagnosed, sometimes diagnosed, who die. And really, when you look at it with hindsight, it's difficult to justify what's happened. So I think that's probably part of it.
They have tried to put steps in place in Kent and certainly some of their areas by having a community psychiatric nurse.
Triage.
Triage, and also present or custody suites so that they can assess the person if they think they're at significant risk. At least it's a professional experienced in that assessing that risk is done. But
so just to pick up on that point, so a number of forces have got a street triage pilot, various different guises, but effectively it's a police officer and a psychiatric social worker or similar who go out together, and they try and send them to any call that they identify relates to a person who is mentally ill. And in the areas where the triage is in place, in all the evaluations I've seen, the number of Section 136 detentions has very significantly reduced. Now, one of the things about this, talking to the officers involved in the triage, is when you have that call at 3 o'clock in the morning, the mental health worker who goes along says to the person, I can see you've got a bit of a problem, that you're in crisis. I can arrange an appointment for you tomorrow with the community outreach team. Are you happy with that? Oh yeah, very happy with that. So on that basis, the person isn't detained, they're referred to the team tomorrow. So you could say that's a really good outcome because they've not been detained under Section 136. But it rather depends on whether the outreach team is able to address their needs, because otherwise, rather than a revolving door into the police amount, it's going to be a revolving door into health amount, because the number of people in crisis is clearly going up. So the triage, I think, is interesting. What I wanted to do was to do part of the evaluation in an area that has a triage and previously didn't, to look at the categories of incidents, because I think the reduction in Section 136 will be entirely within the self-harm, because those are the ones that I think health are really well able to negotiate away, whereas police officers are terrified of negotiating them away. So I think that's what the answer would be. But at the moment, all of the evaluations have just looked at the number of Section 136. They haven't looked at the reasons why, which is interesting.
Any more questions or comments?
Could I just ask one question? We used to have, correct me if I'm wrong, in Kent, we used to have Woodlands was a place where adolescents, young people.
No, there isn't.
So they didn't replace that with anything
No,
else?
it's South London is the
How
only...
did they justify that?
I don't know, when you consider the number of cared for children in the East Coast towns, Margate, Roundabout and Broadstairs, and the frequency with which they go missing, and the frequency with which they have mental health issues given their backgrounds, it's not surprising. It is a real problem for the police that if they detain them, the nearest unit to take them to is in South London.
It's terrifying. I think that's their first
Yes.
sort of, that's their first experience of dealing with mental health. They're going to be put off, as you, in one of your earlier slides, going to be put off a lot, which was a quote from someone.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, there are so few units. I mean, there's one in Essex. There's a treatment unit in Essex. There's another in London. But there are so few units with beds available for children and young people. And indeed, on a daily basis, there are no beds. I mean, nationally, it's code black all the time. There are no beds for mental health treatment.
Yes.
This is a different question, but is it possible that the section is not unusual because
The PowerPoint?
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right.
I think they do go on. It's being filmed as well.
That
should be video.
So I mean the references, if you're interested in research, the HSCRC, the Health and Social Care Information Centre, is the most wonderful resource. Just extraordinary, the data that they have. And there's no, I mean I've looked across Europe to see if I could find data, and there's no other country in Europe that has anything like the data on HSCRC. And it's free. Well, unless you ask for a really obscure analysis, which they'd ask you to pay for, but it's all free. And you could spend your whole lifetime just mining HSCRC data to find interesting things.
Yeah, Lynn.
Can I just ask one more thing about people with learning disabilities?
Yes.
And do you have any figures for how often they're detained under Section 136?
Technically, they can't be detained under Section 136 because of a slide I glossed over right at the very beginning. Because the Mental Health Act, as amended, says that it would not normally include a learning disability unless that disability is associated with abnormally aggressive or seriously.
Yeah.
But the point
Very
is,
easily be abnormally aggressive and seriously responsible as well.
yes. But the point is, this is kind of irrelevant in a sense because the whole issue is what the police officer judges mental disorder to be, and they're not clinically trained in any way.
Mm.
So, if a police officer says, "Oh, no, I think you're mentally disordered," for their purposes, you're mentally
Yeah,
disordered.
so basically you can't see it in the figures.
It's
so
not.
maybe,
It's
but
not
you
available.
can't
When
see
I've
it.
looked at the health figures, because where the police present someone to a mental health unit to do an assessment, they have a really nice self-carbonating pad that they fill in. And the nice thing is the bottom one is the one that gets sent off to NHS data, and of course the bottom one is the one you can't read. So the data that ends up centrally is fairly poor anyway. But I don't think, unless someone corrects me, I don't think that learning disability is identified anywhere in the process.
It's only it's normally process. It says there, which is
So there must be, in the same way that there will be some people who get swept up into the process who actually have dementia because they're violent, abusive or whatever, or they're lost and disorientated in a public place. They will get rounded up because actually, what else can you do with them? When I joined the police, young man, and those days when you joined, they used to stick you in the front office. And I sat in the front office, and one of the first people that came through the door was a little old lady who wanted up to the counter, and she said, "Sorry to bother you, officer, but I can't remember who I am." And this is 1980. And I said, "Oh, go sit down over there, do have a think about it." And then I went out the back to my mates and said, "You're not fooling me with this lady you sent in as a joke. I'm not falling for this." And they all went, "What lady?" And eventually I believed them, actually, she was genuine. And so I went out to the front and said, "Have you had any thoughts, dear?" And she said, "No, I can't." So I took her for a walk up and down the high street, and eventually she recognised her house. And so this business of dementia and everything, it's been around for over years. And the sequel to it is, I said to her, "What you need to do is put a note in your handbag, say who you are." And about 4 years later I went to a sudden death, which was her, and the whole house was full of notes. She'd certainly taken my advice. She'd written everything down. So
it's always been there, and it will be there worse and worse, I guess. So there you go.
Right, okay, any other comments? Well, drinks time. So thanks ever so much, Allyn, and all the best with the rest of the PhD. Thanks.